I don't know when you are viewing this video, but it's being recorded shortly after the holiday season here in the U.S. That time of year from Thanksgiving through to Christmas and New Year's. That time of year when you see lots of advertisements on TV for charities, tapping into the giving spirit of the season. And lately, the Tuesday after Thanksgiving has been dubbed Giving Tuesday. I guess the thought is that after Black Friday and Cyber Monday, we can take a few minutes to share with those in need after we've splurged on ourselves. Probably not a bad idea. And all this focus on charity got me thinking, wondering, how well do we as Christians stack up on this topic? How well do our churches do when it comes to charity, sharing our blessings with those less fortunate? I suppose a lot of people would assume that churches set a really high bar when it comes to this. But how do we get beyond just assuming that? How do we validate whether that's actually the case or not? As a group of Christians, we're supposed to be a light on a hill, a beacon of goodness and love in a dark world. We say these things all the time. So when it comes to charity, sharing with those in need, how well do we actually stack up? Are we setting a good example for the world? I wondered about this, but wasn't sure how one would go about doing that assessment. So like most people these days, I sat down at the computer and started searching. After a little while, I was able to focus down on two big categories. The first is church finances. How do we as Christians or Christian organizations use our money? What do we do with all that money that is collected each Sunday in churches all across the country? The second category was the legitimacy and effectiveness of charity organizations. What kind of standards were there to assess if a charity organization was properly using the money they collect? This is for all kinds of charity organizations, regardless of whether they do or don't have any Christian affiliation. In the general society, what's the standard for measuring whether a charity is doing a good job? So, if you put churches, the vast majority of which are tax exempt as charity organizations, up against those general standards, how would they do? Would they be a beacon of goodness, charity, love for the world to see? They are, after all, taking advantage of tax-exempt status by declaring themselves as a charity organization. Let's look at some data. We'll start with the general assessment of charity organizations and the broader society. Then we'll look at church spending. Consumer Reports says a charity is effective if it spends at least 65% of its funds on the actual charitable cause, with the remaining 35% going to fundraising and overall administration, things like buildings, salaries, etc. Obviously, the more you spend on the charitable cause versus your internal spending, the better your rating, the more effective you're considered to be. There's also an organization called Charity Watch that rates charities, giving them a letter grade from A+ to F. I'll put the summary of their rating criteria on the screen. The program percent column is about the percentage of their funding that goes to the actual charitable cause. The cost to raise $100 column is how effective they are at fundraising. The less you have to spend on fundraising, the more of your money you can spend on the actual charitable cause. If we focus on the program percent column, you'll see that an organization gets an A+ if they spend 90% or more on the charitable cause. And the grade rating drops off, as you would expect, as the percentage spent on the charitable cause drops off. The B grades start with when a charity funds less than 75%. The C's start at less than 65%, the D's at less than 50%, and you get an F, a failing grade, at 35% or loss of your money going to the actual charitable cause. There's nothing particularly surprising about this. I think a declining scale like this is what any reasonable person would anticipate. You can argue with the cut points, but overall it's very logical and sensible. Okay, so now we have a worldly or cultural standard, if you will, a pretty objective, rational approach to rating the effectiveness of any given charity. So now let's move to the second set of data, church economics. Since the vast majority of churches register as charity organizations, how do they spend their money? Churches are private organizations and aren't required to file all the annual reports like most charity organizations, so getting the actual data can be a little harder, but not impossible. There is research available to give us a rather good idea of how churches spend their money. One such source is the National Study of Congregations' Economic Practices. It breaks the data down in a number of ways, by religious tradition, by geography, by age demographics, etc. But let's take a look at the overall use of the money collected by churches. The report I'm using was published in 2019 for data collected regarding 2018. Not brand new, but certainly recently enough to give us a good idea of where the money goes. I'll put a chart on the screen to show you how the money is spent according to this 2019 report. The biggest spend category is personnel at 49%. So just barely shy of half of the money collected goes to pay church leadership and staff. 23%, or just shy of 1/4 of all the money collected, goes towards paying for facilities, church sanctuaries, offices, classrooms, youth buildings, etc. 11% goes to missions, 10% to various programs or ministries, and 6% to dues to the central denominational headquarters or other administration and overhead. So that means that 78% is spent internally on salaries, facilities, and dues. That leaves 22% to go towards external efforts such as missions and other ministry programs like benevolence or education. And candidly, that is being a little generous because some of the 10% going to ministry programs are internal programs spent on the members of the church. But we'll give the benefit of the doubt and say that 22% goes to external causes, missions and other ministries. Now, let's compare those two data sets. I'll put the charity rating scale back on the screen. There it is. And now, let's see where the 22% that churches spend on missions and other ministries falls on that scale. That is a big, fat, dismal F. Not even close to being anything other than a failing grade. You're probably saying what I said when I first compared this data. That may be the average, but I'm sure my church does much better than that. I have served in church leadership. I've been a direct part of making the budget decisions, how we were going to spend the money that we collected. And the church that I was a part of took great pride in being good stewards, spending the money wisely, not spending all the money on ourselves like so many other churches did. So I pulled the latest budget information I had for that congregation. And sure enough, the numbers were better than the national average of 78% and 22%. Some might even say they were significantly better. Those numbers came out to 65% and 35%. So let's put that 35% on the charity organization rating scale. Oops, still an F. Still a failing grade. Almost made it to the D category, but just missed. Now look, we can try to explain why this isn't a fair comparison. Why churches are really very different than these other charity organizations. How there wouldn't be nearly as much money going to causes if it weren't for churches. Before we get all defensive and try to rationalize away these data sets, Let's look at a few Bible verses. Pure religion is to take care of the widows and orphans. James 1:27. Don't store up on earth where moth and rust destroy. Matthew 6:19. Go and sell all that you have and give it to the poor. Matthew 19:21. But she out of her poverty put in all she had to live on. Luke 2:14. 21:4. Whatever you've done for the least of these, you've done for me. Matthew 25, verse 40. Do not neglect doing good and sharing, for with such sacrifices, God is pleased. Hebrews 13:16. There are a lot of verses in the Bible about using what we've been given by God to help those in need as a way to demonstrate God's love and open doors to spreading the good news of the gospel. What I can't find are those verses that say spend a lot of money on buildings or pay a group of people to do the work of the church that the Bible says we're all supposed to be doing as the royal priesthood. I've looked. I can't find those verses. If this all feels pretty uncomfortable for you, I understand. You're not alone. I'm dealing with some of those same feelings myself, those same uncomfortable feelings. But the facts are the facts. As a collective group of Christians, our charity efforts get a failing grade compared to the common worldly standard. As I see it, there are 3 ways we can respond to this situation. 1, we can stick our head in the sand and ignore it. We're actually pretty good at that, in my opinion. 2, we can jump through hoops and rationalize and explain it all away, why these measures and standards don't apply to us. Or 3, we can humble ourselves and pray to God that He'll show us a better way and give us the love and courage to do something about it. You know as well as I do that the only one of those 3 approaches, that only one of those is legitimate, and that's the third and final one. I don't have a bunch of answers, but I'm smart enough to see that the way we've been doing things isn't good enough. When Jesus says that it is better to give than receive, I can't imagine that spending almost 4 times as much on ourselves as we do on others is what He had in mind. There's just no way that's what He meant. Some of you may be asking why I would even bring this topic up. Well, I think the Apostle Paul said this is the kind of thing we should do. 2 Corinthians 13:5 says, "Test yourselves to see if you are in the faith. Examine yourselves!" Exclamation point. Examine yourselves. And are we to think that this would somehow exclude taking a serious look at how we spend our funds? How we spend our funds, what God has blessed us with, is one of the most obvious ways we signal to the world what we're all about. We need to examine that. I pray that God will open our eyes and show us a better way. I know He will, if we're willing to ask, and then be willing to follow where He leads us. We can find a better way, or we can keep spending most of the money that we collect on salaries and buildings and ourselves. No one is forcing us to do that. We've made that choice ourselves, and we can make a different choice if we want to. I hope this gives you some things to think about. We need to be sending the right signals to the world and setting a holy example. Not a flicker in the distance, but a beacon on the hill. Thanks for listening. God bless you on your journey.